Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to try to wrap this up to get to lunch because that is pretty important. This course, you may want to take away some things. So if you want to have this link that's in the chat, you can either see the presentation and follow along with me, or you can make your own copy because there are some live links in there. We're going to talk real briefly about how you get to design a course. And these are some of the sections that we'll go over in this session. And if you want to save this Google presentation in your own drive, once you open this link, you can click here and have your own copy. I'm Corey Bauer. I'm an instructional designer at West Liberty. I previously worked at Indiana University in Indiana, not in Pennsylvania, where I did courses for the national parks and the Bureau of Land Management and Fish and Wildlife. So we worked with the Department of Interior. And then I was an ed tech coach. So I worked with K-12 schools to do ed tech tools. You know, iPads had come on the market about 10, 15 years ago, touchscreen monitors and all these things that are kind of coming out and help teachers transition to that. And I have been a teacher for middle school and high school where I taught computer science and social studies. So things that don't go together is kind of what I taught. So if you want to send me an email to get access to any of this stuff, you can send it to this email address here. So how the session will work is going to be a little bit shorter because I do want to get you to lunch on time. You can access the stuff on your own device. There's the link once again if you didn't get it. And if you have any questions, just put them in the chat or raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask. We'll go as fast as we can. So here are some of the learning objectives, and I'll go over these, why those are so essential when you're doing a course. There's really a lot of thought that goes into your course before you ever actually make any content. And so these objectives here, 1 through 7, will actually be labeled on the bottom, so you know why I'm telling you these certain things. So, for example, in West Liberty, we develop a course cycle in kind of a certain way. First, the course has to be officially approved and have a number of credits attached to it, because that number of credits is pretty essential on how much work we think is going to go into a course. We have to justify a college level credit. The same thing goes into designing high school courses for diplomas. You kind of have to know what you're valuing this course to be. Most of our courses are about a semester. It takes a semester to actually build it with someone called a subject matter expert, which is also called a SME. But in theory, the planning process of the course starts way before that semester ever happens. And we're trying to shift to that at West Liberty, where we have more thought and more prep time into a course before we get to the design schedule. Because the more thought that's in it, the faster that design cycle can go. And with a small team like we have, it's faster and we can take on more projects, because the transition to having online classes and online programs is coming pretty heavy across all schools, because a lot of students cannot take off and go move to somewhere for a couple of years to do their studies. So online is becoming such a in-demand offering. Here's one of the links that you could have. So we do subscribe to Quality Matters, which is an accredited institution that will have a rubric of how your course is built and whether it's good and justifiable. Now, there are rubrics for K-12 and higher ed, and depending on your institution, whether you're doing professional development and such, there are different rubrics to justify whether the online instruction is quality. And those things kind of change a little bit over time. In fact, June 5th, there's going to be a new rubric out for higher ed. What it looks like, we're not quite sure, but we think that it might have more emphasis on accessibility, because we do have a lot of people with different needs, vision, hearing, and that kind of stuff. So these are going to change. So whatever you see now is kind of the old version. The new ones are coming out, and you can access these rubrics and kind of judge your course after it's fully built, whether you've hit some of those things. If you want your course to be officially judged, you can pay for that, but that's kind of up to your institution. When your course is officially done, then you can offer it to students because it's been through the development process, it's been evaluated, now we think it's really ready to go. But that may not be the end of your course. We kind of use the rule of thumb within 5 years because things change. I mean, Mary Lee's presentation was changing as she was making it because new things come out. So depending on kind of your content area, things change very fast. So 5 years may be too long. Things for like history, that might be good enough. So you can kind of go through the cycle, but then you have to keep reiterating, is this the best version of this course? So in the pre-planning stages, you need to think about why would you have a course in the first place? Because courses cost money for students and they don't want to take fluff classes. I mean, they do view some of the classes that way. But it's so much less stressful if you have a clear idea of what you want students to accomplish when they're done with that course, and that you have very intentional activities in those courses, and it's all kind of nicely, tightly packaged together. And it's also less stressful for the faculty if you know that the whole course is done when you're teaching it, rather than trying to build week by week. And as instructors, we've all had those times where we were just a week ahead of the students, and it's very stressful. But it's nice to know you have this whole thing that's wrapped around and it's very nicely structured. It's also easier to know that you've already checked all the links and the images and the access and the copyright issues and anything else that might be in a course, because it's kind of all wrapped up together. You kind of worked those all out. And one of the things that we keep in mind is when we're developing a course, if that person developing the course gets hit by a bus, we kind of need some lead time to find someone else to build the course. So we kind of have that in mind when we're planning things like that. And so the point of a course is really just stated in your course learning objectives. Why does this course exist? What is the student supposed to do at the end? We call these course learning objectives, or CLOs. They're very broad, they're very measurable. They use Bloom's taxonomy about, can they explain, can they identify, can they measure, can they apply, those kind of verbs. And it really justifies why you have a course. And so the example of what a good CLO versus kind of a bad CLO really comes down to, is it measurable and is it specific? So if you have the presentation open, you can click on this wheel here to see a bigger version of this, because it is quite small in the presentation. But when you have some kind of learning objective that says be aware, how would you measure someone's awareness? It's not very specific. So if you have something like describe, you can measure that in a little bit better way. In the red box, the relationship of diseases to pharmaceuticals is very, very broad. It's hard to measure that and what exactly you're looking for. So a more specific one would be the interaction of the disease states with these pharmacological approaches. So this was a course for drugs and kind of exercise and some of these diseases. So it's very tailored to that course. And here's an example of a good CLO, and I'm gonna pick on Nicole because I actually took these from your courses. If you have a course number, the action verb, what it is they're doing, and kind of the condition of how they're doing it, you can write your learning objectives in a much more formulaic way. So you kind of can piece these together, because sometimes it's a little bit harder to write what looks like an awkward sentence. But if you have this formula, you can kind of pick up what you need to have, and then you can number them so you can start putting them in your course in a more logical way. Now, we also have something called module learning objectives, or MLOs. So the course learning objectives are the broad things of why you would take a course, but then when you get into the course and your chapters and your modules, or your lessons, whatever you call them, you need more specific ones. They are very, very specific and very attached to certain activities. So, for example, if you have this CLO of describe the interaction of disease states and pharmacological approaches, it's very specific, it's measurable, and it has an action verb. Maybe a very specific version of that, when you get to module 10, is explain how different medical approaches impact hormone dysfunctions, because that would be a very specific topic in your course about how these drugs interact with hormones of humans or animals. So you're looking for something very narrow, and so your assignments would go very specifically to this explain. Would it be a paper? Would it be a presentation? Would it be a research project on hormone dysfunctions? But it's very, very specific. So it's very intentional about why it's there. And so another example, if you have your broad CLO of English, you might have very specific ones. You arranged, you write, you identify. And then you're talking about paragraphs, you're talking about sources, you're talking about a logical order or in a short writing. The conditions are very specific, they're very measurable, and they're very targeted to very specific activities. Some of the policies, and this is kind of a rule of thumb, it's not really a hard and fast rule, but it's something that at West Liberty we try to gauge when we're judging how much work is in a course. So we do have a definition here, an official one of what a unit of credit is. And so typically a semester is 15 weeks of instruction and a week of finals. And we're saying if you have a 3-hour class, it's roughly about 3 hours per week per hour of that course. So if you're going to have a 1 credit course, which is sort of short, you have about 3 hours of work between instruction and what the student is doing. If you have a 3 credit course, then you triple that by 3. So kind of these icons here is if you have about 1 hour of instruction that the student would take, say you have a Monday, Wednesday course, they have about an hour of stuff that they're getting. Then on the outside, they're having, about 2 hours of work to prep for that class or do the homework from that lecture. So you kind of have this formula to kind of gauge whether you got enough content to justify a college credit. And that's kind of a gray area. What we kind of give you as a rule of thumb is whether it's an online class or face-to-face or hybrid, it doesn't matter, it's all kind of the same. You're getting the same amount of instruction. And so we've kind of said, if for a 3 credit hour course, the instructor is going to have about 2,700 minutes of stuff going on. They're giving their expertise, they're showing videos, they're doing kind of all these things that are teaching. The students are doing that outside at another rate. So you're trying to kind of gauge this. This isn't hard and fast. Some courses have more heavy content than others, but you're kind of eyeballing it to see if it's, if it's too easy of a class or if it's too hard. And so sometimes it's a little bit hard to decide whether, how long is it going to take someone to read something that's kind of subjective, but, maybe a minute a page, something like that. If they have to do a lot of math problems, maybe, 2 to 5 minutes per problem, you're kind of judging it. It's kind of just a rule of thumb, but it's kind of guiding you so you have enough content that justifies the course. So if your course is offered in different formats, and at West Liberty we have quite a few, the traditional model is 16 modules, 16 weeks, the 15 weeks instruction and 1 week of wrap up and finals. We're saying the student's going to have about 8 hours every week of stuff. And typically they might have 4 to 5 classes of that. So you're talking, almost a full-time job worth of work. If you have an accelerated class, which is half a semester, which is common at West Liberty, you have 8 modules instead of 16, you're kind of doubling it. So they're doing about 16 hours a week for that class. So typically a lot of grad programs will have 1 or 2 courses every 8 weeks because you are doing a lot of work in those 8 weeks. And then if you have a summer course, typically 6 weeks is kind of the medium way. You're talking about really a full-time job crammed into those 6 weeks. You're talking about 22 hours of work for that 1 class. So typically we don't have students who have a whole bunch of classes in the summer because the content is the same. Now, there is a misconception that if you're taking a semester class and altering the delivery schedule, the tendency is to cut some stuff out. But really, you're just altering how much is going into each week. It's the same amount in the end because you're still justifying those credit hours in the end. So that is kind of a hard concept that when we alter these courses in a different format, sometimes we want to just cut. This rubric, these are the current categories for the 6th edition. In 2 weeks, this may change. It would be slightly different. But when a course is done, we think it meets Carnegie standards. We think it meets the CLOs and everything's aligned. We kind of look at it with, a final eye. Doesn't meet these criteria. We do typically internal ones, because if you pay an outside peer reviewers or somebody who's certified to do the official rubric, it does cost. But since we're a member, we can kind of do it internally, and that's what the instructional designers do. Mary Lee does. We kind of say, did you get about 85% of these? Roughly a B. Then great, we're moving on. If you didn't quite hit these at 85, we can tweak some stuff and get it up, because we really wanted it to be a good quality course that's going to maybe withstand a couple years before it's refreshed. So it is kind of did we at least hit this threshold? Did we at least get over the hurdle to get to that? And these are going to be updated here in about 2 weeks. Something we have created to help people plan before they get to the development cycle is called a course content planner. And here's where you might want to use your links if you have the presentation open. So if you know how long your course is going to be, whether it's a summer class, a half semester, a full semester, you might start thinking in the term of that time frame and how many modules you might have. So we kind of made this template of, how do you start gathering all this stuff? You have AI, you have open resources, you have all these databases, you have textbooks. How do you get all this stuff together? And sometimes you need a visual to see it. So this spreadsheet, which you can make a copy of your own, is kind of your planning. It's not a traditional lesson plan template like what Mary Lee showed you where the AI can generate it. It's more of like a plotter and a calendar in a way. So you would have your, here's an example. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger because it is smaller. So we do have our modules, and this is a course, a graduate course in the education department that I worked on. We do have 8 modules. It's an 8-week offering course. It was through 3 credits. We kind of had the topics for each module. We have the course learning objectives here in purple. And then we started working on very specific module learning objectives that would tie into these. So in the parentheses, this one is supporting that very first standard. In this particular class, there was a book, and this one happened to be a physical book. So I put the link to the Amazon. This instructor kind of plotted out what chapters they were going to cover with each module, because it goes back to that topic. They pulled in some articles from databases, websites, wherever they wanted, because they kind of wanted that supporting material. There were videos in the beginning, and we started making forum topics or discussion topics that might relate to that idea. And some of these notes that you're seeing in here we were planning, like, what's the rubric we wanted to have? Do we want to have different points? We kind of want the discussions to be similar, so there's a pattern and students know what to have or what to expect. And then we start working on assignments. What are some of the pieces of activities that students would demonstrate to get back to these learning objectives? Where do they need to be? What kind of rubrics? How are we going to judge whether they met those learning objectives or not? And this particular class didn't have a quiz or exam, but you could plot here if you're halfway at module 4, you might want a midterm. Here at the end, you might have a final project, and then work backwards to say, well, you need this piece of the project done, say module 6 or module 4. You're kind of seeing the whole course at one time. So it's easier to wrap your head around what you've got going on than flipping through this page and this page and this page in a website, because it does get a little bit hard for your brain to see the bigger picture. And so I was making these as an instructional designer so I could keep track of a whole course at a time, because I was working on multiple courses. And we kind of learned that maybe the faculty could have this document ahead of time, and you might spend a semester or 2 or 3 working on what do you need this course to be. Especially when you have multiple courses in a program. What do you need all these courses to do to align? So it's a really tight, quality program. And so you kind of need this visual in some kind of way. So here's a bigger example. We have the title, you can link to the actual document that say, here's what is in module 1, here are all the activities, the links and stuff. The instruction, here's what I want to say on the page, here's the instructions for how to do this assignment that are very specific. You have your learning objectives. If you have a textbook, any outside articles, your video links, and kind of all these things that you would have to see the whole course at one time. And it's helpful if you worked on this as a department. Here are all the things that we want these students to do. We have common rubrics, we might have common assessments. And it helps you pace. So whether you're 6 or 8 or 16 weeks of delivery, it kind of shows you how much you're going to have in that week or that module. And it kind of helps you judge how much time is a student going to spend in that module. Is that realistic? Is it too little? Is it too much? So you can hit those Carnegie standards. You can kind of think of a module as an entirely packaged lesson that's going to be ready to go. You've got your reading, your instruction, your assessment, your activities. It's kind of all there. And if you know you have a big project, you need to scaffold it over multiple modules. So you tell them in the first couple modules, hey, there's a big project at the end. You need to have this done by this point, this done by that point. So you're not saying, oh, it's week 15. By the way, you have a major project due next week. So it's also helpful to see it as how a student might experience it. In the course planner, and you can make a copy, a template here if you want, it's easier to start with your course learning objectives first. What is it you want the students to do? And can kind of work down. Sometimes you know that for your program, you might have a specific assessment at the end or project that you know is kind of being required and work back in planning. Then when you know kind of some of those pieces that you have to do midterm, you have to do final, you can work on specific topics. Sometimes your topics you may need to rearrange in order because it makes more sense. Or, you have a really heavy module here and it's right before the exam, that might be a little too much. You want to rearrange it so it's a little more balanced. It kind of helps you see that whole thing. Then as you're grabbing articles and videos and stuff that you find, you have somewhere for it to go. You have all the links kind of organized, so it's easy to go later. When you're grabbing all this content, and some of the sessions have touched about this before, every class has to have instructors giving something. That's why they're taking the class. The instructor has some sort of expertise they're giving. And so some of those in-class instruction stuff, even if it's online, are kind of in a category. So we have student or instructor to student interaction, and we have student to student interaction. If you summarize a textbook or reading, you have a PowerPoint for your students, you're giving them rubrics that you're explaining how they're going to be assessed. Those are kind of all going to that 2,700 minutes of instruction that for a typical 3-hour course. Students also need to interact with each other, even more so in an online class, because they don't get that face-to-face time with each other. So this is kind of the hardest part for a lot of online teaching is, how do you replicate some kind of community when the community is spread out all over the place? So if you have a discussion, they have blogs, they get to work on wikis together, they might annotate articles, they might work on grading each other's stuff, projects. You have something where the students are kind of bouncing ideas off, they're kind of getting some feedback. They also might be sharing how they're learning with each other, because learning is kind of a social thing. So we're kind of judging the left category here as that 1 hour a week times 3 for your credits. And then the second one is the other rest of that piece. That's the big piece of the course. Some of these have been touched already, but things that you have, we have a library database. You get all these articles. If you need them for your class, we love to generate business so-called to the library. So every click helps justify us paying for these resources. So if courses are really heavily using it, we get to keep those sources. Tools that may not get much use, tend to get cut when it comes to budget time. We have a lot of textbook companies that are working with Sakai. They work with Canvas and Blackboard about getting stuff that will work into our LMS. And so in August, we're going to have an agreement with Barnes and Noble that a lot of our content is going to just populate in. And some of those things are interactive tools, simulations, videos from the publishers, so we can kind of have it housed in this Sakai. There's lots of OERs, which you saw earlier this morning, and if you click here, there's another source for that. YouTube videos are great. If your instructions in YouTube, so you have a nice video that you can use, that's great. It embeds very well. If you're wanting to create your own, as I did as a teacher, because I never got anything handed to me, or if you want help from somebody like me or someone at your department that does that, we can help you make stuff because we get all kind of cool tools. We kind of touched on this briefly that, you know, if you were to take a book and scan it all off and hand it off, you might not be legally covered for that. So if you have Creative Commons or open source stuff, that's a lot better. We do have links and accounts for students to quickly log in and get access to these database articles because we do pay for that. If you want to you found something on the internet, it's just somebody's stuff. If you can have an email that says you have permission to use this and you screenshot that, we can put that into the course to say, yes, we kind of did have permission to do this. So if it's somebody's picture, another instructor made it, we can do that. We are keeping some of the files in each course. So when we hand this package course over to somebody else to teach, everything is there, that nobody should ever have to go find stuff unless it broke. When we go back to those learning objectives, that's how you're making the assessment whether this course was worth it and it did what it needed to do. Did the students do these things and you can measure them with some kind of reliability? Not everything has to be assessed. I was kind of one of those teachers that if I assessed everything, I was going to make myself crazy with the grade book. Some things need to be assessed because I can and they're measurable. It is sometimes hard to, you know, assess certain things like a quick discussion or a comment, but an exam, a project, those things are much easier. You also need a mix of informal versus formal, because some people do get weird when they know they're being formally assessed and evaluated. There's kind of that pressure, that performance anxiety. So if you have something informal where it's not graded, they can be right or wrong, they're kind of learning from it, and it's, you know, a kind of a calm, short activity, balance those out with the ones that are really hard and heavy and worth a lot of points. And if you can have any kind of student generated work that's really authentic and it's easier to see what they learned from it. It's going to get a little bit harder with some of the AI stuff, but if they have something they have to create, they have to explain their learning. It's still very measurable and accessible, but what did they actually learn? You get a much deeper takeaway from it. So we do have a couple courses that are in Sakai, and if you're with West Liberty, we can give you access to them. We have one that's a beginning, kind of more deeper, log me out, a deeper version of this presentation about how do you get to planning a beginning course? What do you need before you sign up to say, hey, will you build my course? The second one, well, these are not loading. The second one is about how do you, once you're in that development stage, what does it need to do? Kind of some of the things you're thinking about, where are good textbooks, options, what are good activities, how do you make rubrics and that kind of thing. And then the last course is really specific to Sakai. How do I do some of these things that the Office of E-Learning is doing in some courses? How do I embed stuff? How do I get a rubric to attach? How do I do these new tools that are coming out? It's sort of the accumulation of you've already taught some and developed some, now you're ready for that advanced level. If you are not with West Liberty, we do have a non-LMS version that you can access, we can give you, that goes more deeper into some of these things. So if you do want that, shoot me an email and I can give that access to you. So I'm trying to get you out here for lunch because food is very important. Do you have any questions or anything I can explain better? No? So we are ready for lunch. Your next course, you're going to do lunch at 12:30. So you have about a 40-minute lunch. So if you don't have any questions, we're gonna cut this session and then we'll see you back in a little bit.